Hey y'all, guess what I finally finished? I mean, it's not a surprise you looked at the cover of this video, but I am very excited to talk about this book today, even as it comes in wake of this unfortunately not winning the young adult supernatural category in the Goodreads Choice Awards. I am a little bitter about it, mostly because it was so close, which is already very impressive considering that this book came out so much later than Gallant did. And I am a fan of V.E. Schwab, but one, I don't think that Gallant is her strongest title, and I don't think it's a young adult. I think it's a middle grade. I think it deals with some of those darker themes, but again, or maybe not again, I think that we do a disservice to middle grade readers when we assume that if a theme is a little darker, that it is not for them. Because I do think that there is a lot of interest in that kind of darkness at that age. And I think the popularity of things like Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark really emphasizes that as well. But we're not here to talk about Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark, though we are here in some ways to talk about those stories that are told in the dark, the legends that linger, how those legends linger, how they grow, how they morph. And I think that this book really explores as well where we can break away from those legends, and in many ways kind of breaking that generational curse or generational trauma. As with Legendborn, Bloodmarked is incredibly layered and smart and insightful while still being incredibly action-packed and swoony, and just the kind of young adult magic and excitement that I haven't personally felt for a hot second. And part of that is just that I'm getting older. That's time, that's reality, it is what it is. But this series has really recaptured a lot of that magic and kind of fueled it in new ways. It is definitely linked to all of the young adult that I grew up on, even through my early adulthood. You can see where it comes from, even as you kind of see where it's deviating into where it's going. So it's this beautiful blend of tradition and newness that is also at the heart of the story itself. So it's just so incredibly smart in terms of form, in terms of content. It just kind of merges everything across the board, and I wish I was that smart in a lot of ways. And it also gives us one of my favorite protagonists of recent years, Bree, and here we get to see her grow and change and kind of meet the world in new and interesting ways. The first book explores a lot with her in relation to her grief and her anger, and here we're still seeing that anger, but we're seeing it channeled in new ways, and we're seeing power come from that in new ways. And we definitely see that at the end of book one as well. So spoiler for book one, there will be Legendborn spoilers here. I will try to avoid really full Bloodmarked spoilers here. So leave now if you don't want to be spoiled on Legendborn, but I'd love to see you back once you finish because you should read that book. So at the end of Legendborn, Bree is revealed to be Arthur's descendant. And we learn that Arthur's line and Bree's maternal line merging is due to an act of violence. And the beginning of the book really grapples with that, because we were already seeing in book one how Bree, as a young, strong Black woman entering this traditionally white space, how that upset a lot of people within that traditionally white space. And so here we're seeing kind of the spreading of the world, or the widening of the world, as we often do in book two in a series, especially a fantasy series. So it's really doing what it needs to do in terms of kind of the storytelling beats while also playing into the world that has been created here. So we are moving outside of these kind of personal grudges, and we see the very personal side of that in the first book, because putting a face to a lot of that racism was important. Seeing the microaggressions, the overaggressions, just kind of how that was portrayed was important, to know that that exists and to name it and to show it. And the first book also makes clear that that individual racism is also baked into the system, right? That it is a product of the system. So it doesn't divorce the system from the personal, but I think that putting that personal face on it is very important. And then toward the end, we get a kind of merging of the two. And here, picking up in book two, that becomes a lot more obvious. If you are a Buffy fan, and if for any reason your favorite episodes involve the Watchers Council, birthday, that episode where they come and do, you know, just the checkup at the magic box. I don't know, it's been a hot second. I used to know those titles by heart. But if you like the Watchers Council and how they kind of interact with the Scooby Gang, I think you will really like this, because we are looking at, you know, this kind of group that we've watched establish themselves, and these bonds and these kind of tentative trusts, and where some of those tentative trusts will not hold, which I think is super important and super realistic as well. But now we are coming against older, bigger systems of power, and people in power do not want to give up that power. And we also face the way that how Bree has inherited her power, what that means, that her power is coming from the violence it comes from, while also potentially threatening those that currently hold power. And so there are layers and layers, and Bree and the others can't necessarily trust these adults or the figureheads of this society, this secret society, in the way that they maybe hoped they could. And so at the beginning of the novel, Bree is kind of separated from those she knows, from her circle, into this kind of compound of sorts, and they are drugging her and they are testing her. And I mention this specifically because it is a decent portion of the novel. It is a couple hundred pages, and it is hard because it is stressful and we're kind of mired in that. It feels hopeless in a way. We're kind of scratching at the walls as Bree is. Her magic is kind of capped at that point because it's this kind of like mix of the supernatural and a more sterilized version of that. So if we're keeping with our Buffy comparisons, more the Institute. So there is something very hard in that. And part of that hardness, and the reason I want to touch on this, is because I do think it taps into a lot of history related to testing without informed consent, specifically for Black communities. And it is never explicitly called out in the text in the way that other things are explicitly called out, but it is part of the anxiety and the tension and the fear that exists in that space. And I think that this is kind of exacerbated by the fact that at this point, Bree doesn't really have that connection to her ancestors like we see in other parts of the novel and at the end of the first book that kind of gets all of this rolling. So all that to say, I think that that is a really wonderful illustration of the layers that we have going on in this novel as we did in the first. And I'm sure there are extra layers in here that I did not pick up on. For instance, we are picking up after the kidnapping of Nick, who we learn at the end of book 1, though for some reason I keep wanting to say act 1, is not actually Arthur's scion, but Lancelot's scion. And I'm going to be saying that word very oddly because that is one of those words that I read a lot before I learned how to say it, because I did like Arthurian legends and I read it as scion, so apologies. But we have a narrative that largely has Nick and Bree apart in this book after all of the charge of the first one. And that is incredibly rough, but we will get back to that kind of roughness, the angst, the longing, the kind of romantic potentials of the book briefly. But as I was reading, I was like, okay, what were the quests that Lancelot went on? Because we have all of these branches of story in Arthurian legend, and I'm not familiar with nearly all of them, and those I am familiar with to whatever degree, I haven't touched in a hot second outside of reimaginings. So it really made me think about the different knights and their quests and their powers, but it never overpowers the main narrative. And I do think that this starts to move us away from the concept of the table and the Knights of the Round Table in its strictest sense. So as we have this connection to Arthur and Bree's connection to Arthur and that struggle as he is kind of vying for power within her consciousness is at the heart of this. So a lot of this is Bree finding her place. And so to do that, like I said, we have to widen the world. So at the beginning where we have the kind of conflict and power struggles within this institution as we know it, it makes it so that we can't trust and we have to move outside. And it also gives us urgency, a new kind of face of danger, a new kind of tangible villain, because we have this kind of looming threat, and we will get more threats that pepper and build as we go, but it gives us something very strong to push against from the beginning and kind of sets the tone of everything. And this also gets Bree off on a quest of her own of sorts. So this isn't necessarily a road trip book, this is a quest book. And Bree's quest is to kind of figure herself out, even as she feels her quest is to save Nick. And lucky for us as readers, her crew for this quest includes Sel, Alice, and William. And I was very excited because I love William. He is one of those scene-stealing characters. I had just reread Legendborn before picking up Bloodmarked, even though I think that Bloodmarked does an excellent job at kind of recapping itself, so you don't have to do that. One, I wasn't sure how well it was going to recap itself, and two, I just wanted to reread that book because it's so fun. So rereading reminded me how much I love William, and getting to spend more time with him and kind of deepening him and watching his conflict, especially in terms of his kind of instinct and his role within the group as the healer, but also seeing his kind of destruction at the midnight hour when he is Gawain. And it's just a really kind of nice tension, and also he's just a great addition to the group. We've got Alice, and I love, love, love being able to see Alice and Bree kind of at their best as a team, because we had a lot of conflict between Bree and Alice in the first book, which I think all read very true and made so much sense and was kind of heart-wrenching because as a reader, I could see both girls' points of view within their arguments and their fights. And I think those are the kind of fights that are born of a lot of love and history. And so being able to see them kind of excel and take care of each other and banter and play off of each other was really great. And also getting to see Alice shine as a onceborn and seeing her mind celebrated and seeing her hold her own in this magical world in which she's not even really capable of seeing most of the magic. And I also really enjoy how her and William play off of each other because William appreciates that intellect and that sharpness. So I just think that that is a great addition and also a great kind of grounding for the group because it gives them an extra limitation and an extra connection to the real world of sorts. And as readers, it gives us that connection as well. We're able to see things through those kind of fresh eyes and have a way in some ways and see ourselves in this kind of realm. Now, speaking of arguments born of love, we end Legendborn with a kind of tender moment between Sel and Bree, and we pick up here with them kind of butting heads again because Sel wants to keep Bree safe, Bree wants to kind of test the limits of her power and find that power, and she's still kind of ruminating on that tender moment and that kind of Welsh endearment that he shared that she has not looked up because she doesn't really want to know, and also apparently has not read as much Torchwood fan fiction as I did back in the day, and I'll sit with that. I will sit with that for myself, but there is a clear kind of clash of wills there. And then we have this extra layer with Sel because he is separate from Nick, and he has an oath that he's sworn to Nick, and that oath and Nick's presence and all of this kind of protect him from going down the more demon side of his nature. And so he is battling that throughout the book. And Nick's presence kind of looms large between them as well because there is, I would argue, an undeniable attraction between the two, unless I am much less capable of reading than I thought I was. And there's also still the very real passion and care between Bree and Nick because the book still does give us time with Bree and Nick, but I'm not going to spoil how we maneuver that. But we have a love triangle pretty undeniably in a way. And it really got me thinking because there's been a lot of backlash against love triangles for a while. And I think that that is born of one, them having just been so ubiquitous for so long and just kind of a given, and two, them not being done as well because of that. But I think that here it maneuvers it super well. That tension is there from all sides. We understand what each person brings to the other person or tempers or ignites in the other person. There is a lot of respect and love in different ways between everyone. And so it kind of teeters on the edge of a couple of different things. One, this instinct that I have in some love triangles where you're like, just smush them all together. it'll work. And now following Iron Widow, that is seeming like a more plausible option outside of fan fiction. So I'm just gonna sit with that. I'm not gonna articulate any hopes because I don't want to be hurt. Because the other option in this that is more bluntly articulated in the book is this idea of courtly love. And I don't remember the exact term for it, but the whole kind of medieval obsession, I believe medieval, don't report me to my college humanities professor, stems from things like Arthurian legend and this idea that the best love, the most worthy love, the most ambitious love is born of this angst and this pining and this inability to be fulfilled. Because even with Bree and Nick, we have this barrier now, this idea that because she is of the line of Arthur and he is of the line of Lancelot, they cannot be together because this society has built a world in which you cannot cross lines, which is getting into some touchy territory, which I know it's meant to. So there are systems being set up to fall on many different levels, and I am going to be very interested to see which ones fall and whether this idea of courtly love and this suffering and this pining and that being heroic and enviable in a way, if that will be one of the things to fall, and how our love triangle will play out in relation to all of that. And I think this idea of what is going to fall, what systems will fall, what traditions, what ideas, all of this is also explored in the book as we're widening this world in the areas and the parts of the world outside of the Legendborn that Bree is getting to explore, especially in relation to her root craft and her ancestry there. And this part of her and this world gives us the two, I would argue, best settings of this book, including a bar in the middle of nowhere on the crossroads. It's a magic kind of bar outside of, you know, the rules in many ways for those looking to make a deal and that live on kind of the outskirts of magical society, or what the Legendborn would consider the outskirts of magical society. And it's just a fun environment. And here we are introduced to a wonderful new character, although not completely new, because Tracy Deonn is weaving these threads super expertly. I would be fascinated. I haven't watched any interviews with her to know how much of this she plotted out ahead of time, like what was known and what were threads that she left for herself that she's kind of picked up since. I don't know, either way masterful. But we get a new kind of magic demon-y character who is debonair and powerful. And I think this is very important, one, because he's just fun, and he's a little mischievous, and he's a little witty, and he's kind of putting everyone in their place, including Sel, which I think is important because it kind of limits his power a little bit. It reminds us as readers, or shows us as readers, that his power isn't unlimited. And we've seen that power limited within his world, but seeing him thrown off of his guard and how he acts in new environments where he's kind of at a disadvantage and still has this instinct to protect Bree, but he's not the most powerful one in the room potentially, is super interesting. And so we're kind of playing with these power dynamics throughout the book because the idea of these power dynamics is at the heart of this. Bree has to kind of come into her power and claim her power in new and different ways here. She has, in some sense, claimed her power, and now it's the after, and the claiming isn't over. And so it's that kind of calibrating, that re-maneuvering, that re-bargaining to get to where she wants to be, and to have her in power rather than being maneuvered by others or acting in reaction to others. So this is fast-paced, it's fun. Like I said, the first couple hundred pages are a little bit establishing. They're still super fun, especially as we have the banter between, you know, our characters, and we're getting introduced to some new characters. There are some great action sequences, even for me, someone who traditionally doesn't like action, but I think here too, the way it's written is always really on. And it's just so smart, especially because, like I said, we're widening the world outside of the concept of the Legendborn, but we've also opened some doors at the end in relation to the Legendborn, especially because the first book made a point of mentioning Morgaine, and I believe it's called the Order of Morgaine. Listen, not all details am I great at, but I spent a decent amount of this book wondering about that, especially as that is such an important part of Arthurian legend. And this book kind of held it off for a while, but it did open that door for us, and I'll be very interested to see where it goes. I will additionally be very interested to see if we explore Mordred at all. So all in all, this was a really fun, fast-paced, layered, and poignant book. It had so much nuance and layers behind the action and the compelling, fun characters, and there's just so much going on all of these levels, and it's really fun to see how well all of that plays out. And I think that this was a really excellent second novel, and I don't know or haven't read if this is projected to be a trilogy or a longer series, but second books are really hard, especially when you have a book that is centered around such a strong concept, and the structure of the first book was phenomenal. It was excellent, and the beat we ended on, while leaving us open for the second book, absolutely, was also super satisfying. So there was just a great level of skill and care taken with how that was shaped, and I think that that skill and care carried over to this book. It gave us this perfect balance of kind of what we wanted and were craving as readers, especially in relation to the character relationships, but it then also kind of subverted our expectations in a lot of ways and built out this world and these characters beyond what we know, and then used that building to really deepen the ideas that were started in the first book and have only grown further here. So yeah, while this book, like a lot of sequels, is much darker and there is a cost for a lot of what goes on, it also is incredibly satisfying and incredibly fun. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. I'd love to hear where you think or hope the love triangle may end up. I would love to hear where you think and hope Bree may end up, what her final kind of journey is gonna look like, and also why William is your favorite side character. And if he's not, I'm willing to hear arguments, but mostly for either Alice or our new character in book 2. I think those are going to be your strongest cases with me personally, but I will let you argue it. And ultimately, I think just being this excited about characters and relationships and plot points and just the fun of it is exciting. So yeah, let me know what you're thinking, and it will always be the 2022 Goodreads choice of my heart. But thanks for listening to my thoughts. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good, and yeah,